Good morning. Thank you so much for that kind invitation, and introduction. It's clearly 8:15 here, and it's also 8:15 in Minneapolis, where I come from, and so I have no excuse for being as exhausted as I am right now. So when Jim contacted me and asked me to speak, I said, I don't do journalism. That's not my deal. And he's like, oh, a lot of stuff that you do really translates to what we do. And I said, yes, but it's extremely intimidating for me to come and speak to so many people who are clearly so much cooler than I am. And he said, oh, no, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. So what I decided is that I am going to talk about what I know. And what I know about is content strategy for the web. We at Brain Traffic, we largely work on content strategy for large, very messy websites. We also have been assisting large, very messy organizations start to catch up with digital 20 years later. Everybody's still trying to figure it out. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today in my conversation. Now I have half an hour, right? Sweet. I'm on it. I have 28 minutes and 44. Okay, so in 2008, I posted this article called The Discipline of Content Strategy. And at the time, there were about 8,000 results on Google when you typed in content strategy. And they were all over the map in terms of how people were defining it. Strangely, they're still all over the map. But the way that I ended up talking about it was that content strategy plans for or guides the creation, delivery, and governance of useful, usable content. So this apparently, the timing was right to begin to talk about this. Because of this article, I started getting invited to conferences. As you can see, I had no idea what I was talking about, but my pants were very wrinkled. I wrote this book, Content Strategy for the Web. And over time, beginning in 2009, you can see there up to 2016, interest in the term has really, really increased. So it's been an exciting time for Brain Traffic and for content strategists everywhere. And having written one of the first books on the topic, it has served me well because I get invited to speak at conferences and so on. And one of the things that happened is I woke up one day and found that instead of being kind of a content strategist specifically for websites where I was really focused on this, I had sort of graduated to this weird underworld of consulting. So here I am, being a consultant, and what I found is that no longer was I sort of relegated to the back room of website people who were making websites. No, I was at the table with a bunch of very important people all the time, kind of talking VPs and CEOs about their enterprise content and so on. And so I was being asked to come in and help solve really big problems. And when I would come in, I would say, okay, I understand your problem, and the reason you have that problem is because you have this problem and this problem and this problem over here. And here's how I think you could fix it, but that's a really big problem. And so by the end of the day, this is how everybody felt. So I decided I needed to take a step back because I felt perhaps that I was in a little bit over my head. And so I called my friend and cohort, Karen, who works a lot with actually media organizations dealing with content management. And I asked Karen, when you go in and you have these day-long sessions with folks, how does that work? When they get to the end, are they overwhelmed? Are they depressed? Like, I'm seeing this pattern. She said, oh no, everybody's real happy and they all just want to throw more money at me. And I was like, So I decided that I needed to slow down and I needed to do some reflection. So I took some time, and this is a model that my co-author and I introduced in the second edition of Content Strategy for the Web. We call it the quad. So here's the deal with the quad. What's interesting about content strategy, and I know you guys have recognized this and are grappling with it within your organizations, is that for the first time we're really able to talk about the relationship not just between the content substance, the stories that we're writing, what we're reporting on, the information that we're conveying, the challenges and issues we're helping people tackle and solve. The structure of that, which is figuring out how are we going to create this content in building blocks so that we can deliver it and manage it cross-platform. But that the core strategy also connects us to the operations behind it, which are the workflow, how we're getting things done, how content is passing through our organization, among our people, and through the technology, as well as the governance, which is how are we tracking and keeping an eye or oversight of our content over time? What's the relationship and the hierarchy that exists throughout our organizations to make sure that that's happening? Now, here's an interesting pattern that I saw, which is that when I would go in and talk about the content itself, the substance and the structure of it, this was a pretty easy tactical thing for us to think about. You need to audit it. We need to rework how it's organized, the information architecture. We have to rewrite it. But then here was the other thing that would happen, which is that the minute I started talking about the people part of things, this is what people would hear. No matter how I tackled it. And so, in fact, this pretty much sums up how that conversation would go. So I decided I was going to tackle this whole team dynamic and figure out how to really start talking about the culture and the teamwork and the collaborative processes that ended up with this content product that we had. And you can see there are a lot of really great books here that I read. We got Group Dynamics for Teams, Team Geek, A Software Developer's Guide to Working Well with Others. This one is my favorite because apparently the team is calling from somewhere inside the house. And what I realized is that ultimately within these organizations that there are some really foundational things that we needed to talk about in order to work through these massive content strategy issues that have really been plaguing us for the last 25 years. So here were the 5 topics that I want to talk about today: principles, strategy, process, roles, and perceptions. So let's start with principles. So I want to differentiate real quickly here between a rule that we follow and a principle. So a rule is something that is set by some member of authority, some kind of authority that externally compels us to do what somebody else has determined is the right thing to do, whether it is strategic, tactical, behavioral, etc. But a principle is something that actually defines us. This is something that we believe in, a value that we hold that internally motivates us to do what we believe is the right thing. Now, this actually is something that has been adopted by a lot of different organizations across the world more and more. The government digital service gov.uk is actually a site that is sort of held up as like the ideal thing for content strategists everywhere, because if you go to gov.uk, what you will find is that it's all content, and it's clean, and it's clear, and it starts with our user or audience needs. We design that content with data that actually informs our choices. We very clearly understand and do our best to understand the context or the mindset that our audiences is when they hit that content. So if you get to gov.uk, this is their homepage. And what you'll see is that it's all about services and information. It's not about news or, a most recent speech that was given. It's focused specifically on the public who needs to have questions answered about driving and transport, employing people, housing and local services, and so on. And if you see down here, the principles carry through. Start with needs, do less, do the hard work to make it simple. Same here. You look at how and when your benefits are paid. There's not a huge blocks and chunks of text and paragraphs that somebody needs to wade through. It's very clear. It's visually designed to help break out what's the benefit and how often is it paid, which is one of the top reasons people come to this site. Now, what you can see is that in the United States, maybe we haven't so much articulated our design principles with the U.S. Department of Defense and so on, where, articles are like military officials testify on sequestration and readiness, former Norwegian prime minister to lead NATO. This is all very news-driven, but for a member of the public who has very specific or practical, tactical questions about how this service of our country operates, there's almost nothing here. It's enormously difficult to get to that information. So to explore each of these points, I'm going to share with you guys some anonymous client stories. So typically when I walk into a large organization or any of our clients, this is what their content operations look like. So a client that I went into said, we just want to vet this idea with you. We have determined that what we actually need here is United Nations of content operations. So what we plan to do is to shift the operations from an order-taking thing where, I need a paragraph on the home page, or I need a new About Us section, or I need you to write copy for these 12 products. We're going to move everybody into the same house, both physically and metaphorically. So having started with that, here are our content principles that we're going to organize around. First, this content is not for us. This is not content that we are creating so that we can feel better, or so that we can show off, or so that we can check off a box from somebody that's just made a request internally. This content is for our audiences. And we need to take some of our ego out of it and create it to make sure that it is as audience-facing as possible. Responsive does not mean reactive. So when we say we are responding to internal needs, it doesn't mean that we are reacting to somebody else's emergency. And the story informs the format. So instead of saying we need 12 videos, we need to decide what story it is that we are telling and then determine the correct format in which to share and tell that story. So this ended up being quite successful because they were able to articulate these principles and then continually roadshow them, or take them on a roadshow across the organization, to help people understand contextually why they existed and how and why people should come to them for content requests. So when we talk about principles from a collaborative team perspective, establishing those principles for the content that we are creating and how we create it, actually, I have seen in action, helps to unite us in our day-to-day work. So let's talk about strategy. So I like to use a bear when I talk about strategy. So let us all, for a moment, pretend that we are the bear. So if you're a bear, you have a couple of different goals that you need day to day to fulfill. And one of those goals is to be fed, to be sustained, or to eat. So in that instance, your objective, right, or your goal, is to actually get the food into your belly. Now, you have a couple of ways in which to make this goal happen. You can go down to a campground and see if anybody has left any food lying around. You can go forage in the forest for different, foods to eat there. Or you can go down to the river and try to have some fish, try to get some fish. So in this instance, this is the strategy that we, the bear, collective bear, have taken. We have determined this is the path that we will take to get fed. We go down to the river, so this cuts out any other paths for us. Now, when we get down to the river, we have a couple of different choices. We can walk along the shore of the river, the bank of the river, and see if there are any fish lying around, dead fish. We can go into the river and actually bat at fish and try to catch fish to get them there. And in this instance, the bear has made the decision to stand in the river with its mouth open, waiting for a fish to jump in. So that's the tactic. Now, in this instance, if you remove the strategy or the path that we have, we're going to do this again because I went backwards. You can't go backwards in a presentation. All right. So in this instance, if we take away the strategy, we are left with our objective, which is to eat or to be fed, and our tactic, which is to stand in the river waiting for or to stand around with our mouth open waiting for a fish to jump in. And in this instance, having taken away that core strategy, we might as well be sitting in the middle of a field with our mouth hanging open waiting for a fish to fall into it. Okay? So this is the role of strategy. Strategy is a decision to take a path. Strategy is a commitment about what to do and what not to do. So here's my anonymous client story number 2. I walked in and this was the content strategy that the client had established, and they wanted my take on it. So we'll become the industry leader in the financial services arena by providing our clients with superior service, world-class products, and a commitment to excellence at every touch point along the customer life cycle. So the problem is that every client I go into, kind of has this same strategy over and over. This is the phenomenon that we call content marketing, okay? So I said to them, the problem with this is that it allows you to do all the things. Think about some content that you might create that does not fall within this realm. You can make a Facebook page. You can start a Twitter feed. You can tell stories about people in financial stress. You can tell stories about universities who are doing research and experiments or whatever on the financial health of whomever, bears. So I said, let's take a look at this strategy instead. We'll share user-facing, task-based content that makes our customers feel smart and safe, both personally and professionally. So let's break this strategy down. We specifically are talking about user-facing, task-based content. We're talking about helping our customers feel smart and safe. So keep those two things in mind, okay? Now, do we want to rewrite the About Us copy? Anyone? Not so much. Nobody cares. How about improve the help section? Yes, user-facing, task-based. How about creating an interactive company history timeline? Nobody cares. Restructuring our homepage around top tasks? Yes, that is a good place to spend our money based on our strategy. Start some content marketing. And get some user personas. Yes, that's a great idea. Let's identify who our core audiences are and do some research to identify what drives their decision making and kind of makes them tick. So ultimately, strategy acts as a guardrail to sort of keep us on track, keep us safe as we navigate through unknown territories. The other important thing is that it keeps us accountable, not only to our organizations, but also to other team members, because now we have a way to say, we need to prioritize this because this is on strategy. So let's talk about process. This is about the time of the presentation where I want to go come up with a jingle. Anonymous client story number 3. Okay, I'm back at the table, and an organization says, on the way back from New York, our CEO decided, who flew, cross country to San Francisco, made the decision that our organization needs to go agile because he read a book. So they said, we brought you in to talk about the role of content strategy in the agile process. So they kind of, sketched out for me kind of what an agile process looks like and the members of the team and how this is going to work and how does content fit in. I said, it's a little difficult because content as a whole is sort of a complex beast. So this idea of these short sprints around content can be very difficult if you haven't done the due diligence of creating a strategy and really looking at how this process to get to a product is going to affect your organization as a whole. Because content ultimately does not begin and end with a scrum. It begins and ends once you decide to create it in the first place, and then once it gets deleted or archived. And, even just looking through content management, the minute you decide to publish content, you're a publisher, and you need to start behaving like one. And when you start talking about cross-platform content management, then we get into integrated life cycles, which is, enormously complicated. And they said, oh, no, it's okay. It's agile. Plus, we made stickers. So I said, well, okay. And I assigned a content strategist, and she sat down in the very first project cycle and said, okay, guys, how about the content? And immediately just blew up the entire thing. So in this instance, the organization had committed to agile because they fell in love with the methodology. And we cannot in our organizations succumb to this idea that methodology is what's going to save the content or save our digital projects. We can't fall in love with our process. We need to remain open. We need to continually receive feedback and be iterating based on improvement. And ultimately, that organization threw out agile, which was an enormously difficult decision, but it was the right one. So I love this Different methods work or fail because of people. And ultimately, a lot of what I'm talking about today does come back to the people. It comes back to the way that we communicate and the way that we collaborate. So the other thing I want to say is that people, when they're designing and planning, tend to fall in love with artifacts or the deliverables. And this is not what we're in this for. Artifacts, ultimately, when we are doing the planning or the publishing, they're the tools. They're the decision-making tools. They're not the outcomes. They are not what we deliver to our reader. So good process, when we're talking about it and when we think about it, is what helps our organizations move together. So let's tackle roles. At this point, I want to start just telling you who these people are. Okay, so again, we enter into content operations at an organization, and they say, you know, we've made a decision that we're going to follow Zappo's lead and go into a holacracy environment where we're basically just going to throw out all the titles. So here's our plan. We're going to throw out everybody's job titles. We're going to have a series of working sessions to break out day-to-day tasks. We're going to assign our managers kind of these team missions. Employees are going to pick a team based on what they feel are their relative strengths, and then we're going to set goals and review quarterly. And we really feel that this is going to give us, organically will give rise to what we need in our organization for things to go and build into the digital age. Let's do it! I love this slide because it's the most PC slide I've ever included in my entire presentation. But you will notice the tall white guy is still in the middle. So I said, you know, this is when it comes to digital operations, there are specific roles that have sort of arisen over the years that make sense on a project-based level or on a process level. And so maybe we want to just kind of take a step back and think about, you know, how these roles, we don't need a person for each of them, but might be well integrated to ensure that our processes have those accountabilities and those outcomes. And they said, no, it's cool. And they came back with an org chart that kind of looked like this. So, you know, when we're talking about building new processes and new teams, it really does help to begin to establish or identify roles. Now, this is a pretty, you know, old-fashioned or whatever consulting thing, the RACI model, who basically says we need to decide at a project level and even at a larger level for ongoing work, who's responsible for the work, who is accountable for its success, who we need to consult before moving forward, and who we just need to kind of keep informed along the way. So this is sort of how that breakdown can look like, what that breakdown can look like. Pretty practical. The one thing is you need to make sure that there is only one person accountable for the success. We can't have multiple people, and so you can see over here, developers, you need to split out the jobs there. So I wanted to kind of touch on collaborative leadership as well, because if we are serious about building out collaborative process and teams within our larger networked organizations, these are some of the roles to consider. Oh, I'm sorry, we're still on project collaboration. So we need to make sure when we are kicking off a larger project that we get all the people around the table at some point. We make sure that everyone is aligned on what we're talking about and how we're talking about it, and who's accountable for the different pieces. And then we want to identify any real logistical issues that will get in our way. So this is the collaborative leadership that I wanted to talk about. And you know, what's super interesting about this is that we talk about, these are ongoing roles. We talk about the convener, who is the person or the role that says, we are going to establish this process. We're going to establish this new way of working together, and they kind of have the pull and the authority to make that happen. The designer, we consider the process designer. So how is this work? How are the products going to move throughout our organization? The facilitator is the person who actually makes the movement happen in terms of the work and the decision making and so on. Our provocateur is the person who pushes back, who plays the devil's advocate, who is able to talk about, root out the assumptions and the risks. The implementer and prototyper is the person who is actually making the work product. The weaver, that gets a little new agey, is the person who is continually working to make the important connections across the organization or throughout the conversations for people to say, you're working on this, I'm working on this, let's work together. And then the coordinator is the person ensuring that deadlines are met and budgets are met and so on and so forth. So then we get to the governance piece, which is oftentimes the difficult thing for people to capture. And this is where we begin to talk about how we make decisions. And this is something that is often overlooked, simply because, especially when we talk about collaboration, we get that mixed up with the idea of consensus. So we need to make decisions about how we're going to decide who gets to make a final decision. What are the facts that we are operating on that makes us decide to move forward or not? How are we going to confirm them? And then what assumptions are we okay to move forward with? Because ultimately, we do have to live with some assumptions. So our roles give us a place in our process. And again, I want to be clear, a role does not equal a person. A role equals a function for which we are accountable. So sometimes we have 5 roles. I'm sure that none of you can relate to that. Okay, so then finally we have perceptions. Have you guys seen this before? It's pretty hilarious. It's one of my favorite cartoons where how the customer explained it, and then it goes through all of the different people, the programmer, the business, how the project was documented over here, and then what the customer actually really needed. So this is my favorite part of content strategy, actually, because as a content strategist, I need to facilitate conversation between all different kinds of stakeholders, all of whom have different areas of subject matter expertise. So in content strategy, our skills have to include this translation and negotiation. If we are going to continually facilitate conversation that moves us forward. So one thing I would really like to encourage is that as we enter and experiment with and evolve in our different processes, that we are not too shy or proud, frankly, to stop and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you mean by that, especially with all of the different crazy buzzwords that are continually popping up in the digital realm. So ultimately, if we are able to identify and be sure that our perceptions are shared throughout our process, then that really does give way to perspective in terms of how we are embracing and designing process with lots of different people involved. So this is our framework, which is going to disappear. Okay, so if this is our framework, these are the parts of our conversation that I would really like to see brought to the table on our day-to-day work as often as possible. We tend to get really lost in tunnel vision or down the rabbit holes of whatever it is that is most urgent in our day that day. And if we continually challenge each other and ourselves to step back and engage in these conversations, I believe it will improve our work. So here's what I would like to close with. I want to assure you all that no matter how together other organizations seem to be, no matter how with it, that every single one of us in today's age is constantly catching up. There is no being on top of digital. You can be ahead of the curve in one area, but I guarantee there are others behind the curtain where we are sadly what we feel to be that we're being left behind. This is something that we need to acknowledge, and that this is where my role as a content therapist comes in, because every single time I sit down to do discovery work with a client, at the end, I've actually had a guy follow me out to my car to say, how screwed up are we? Is there hope for where we are now? And we are moving forward. We are learning, but I want us to be brave about making mistakes. And also to acknowledge that this can be a really emotional process. And when we are talking about working together collaboratively as a team, it is important that we communicate and are open about what we need, because it does it has been demonstrated via research that the success of teams do depend largely on how they feel about each other. From, do they respect each other? Do we trust each other? So our work in this space is personal. It is something that we own. There is ego involved. There is emotion involved. But most importantly, if we're going to succeed in this space, we need to pursue that success together. 17, oh, now I'm over 18 seconds. So on the phone with my friend Karen, she finally said to me, your work in this space is not to tell people what's wrong. That's not what people want to hear. People want to know how they can be more awesome. And that, when I found out, when I was invited and felt kind of intimidated about speaking here, what I ultimately realized is that the people I am talking to are awesome. So who is awesome? You're awesome. I hope that we have a great couple of days, and thank you very much for letting me open.
Thank you. Thank you.